Hi, everyone. Everyone can hear. All right, so Janet is highly Googleable. And I say that because her background is super extensive, and what I want to do is just, I know there are a lot of people here who have an interest in cross-border China Hollywood investments, as well as just production and things like that. So we're just going to get right into her area of expertise. So Janet, a prominent Hollywood producer with deep roots in China, Janet Yang has an extensive list of film and TV credits, including The Joy Luck Club, The People vs. Larry Flint, Dark Matter, Zero Effect, Shanghai Calling, and High Crimes, to name a few. Her background, born in New York, right? But I read somewhere your first time in China was 1972.
That's correct. I was actually born then, yes.
Yeah, and that's amazing. And so, and you've been, involved in China, cross-border China Hollywood films since the 80s. So I think it was really interesting what was just mentioned here. We're kind of in a chapter of a long book that you have actually been part of. So maybe what's happening now, you can kind of give some insight. It's not new, but maybe there's a lot more color that you can add to it. So your cross-border experience between Hollywood and China, like I mentioned, goes back to the 80s. And it's a time in China's development that many in the industry here have not experienced. Can you give us some insight into what it was like back then versus how it is now?
Very little is the same. China back in the 80s was just emerging from the Cultural Revolution. Everything was very centralized. So in 72, of course, was the middle of the Cultural Revolution, and that's where you heard military music blaring everywhere and everybody was dressed the same. The 80s were a period that was just coming out of that, and it was the Deng Xiaoping era where he said, it doesn't matter if a cat is white or black as long as it catches mice. So there was a sense of exploration. It was actually, for those who have experienced that decade, I think we're very nostalgic about it. It was very optimistic and forward-looking. In 79, U.S.-China relations were normalized, so it was the first wave of students, journalists, business people. So it was very highly exploratory, and I lived and worked at the Waiwenju, which is the Foreign Languages Press. And it was an amazing time because there were, first of all, the old revolutionaries, a lot of Westerners who'd gone to live in China to help build the revolution, along with overseas Chinese, and they had continued to live there through the Cultural Revolution. It was an amazing time because I got to meet the Xingxing Meijan. It was all these artists that were emerging, writers, filmmakers, and everything was a little bit dangerous because you didn't quite know what the boundaries were yet, so you were pushing the envelope, but very exciting, and I forged a lot of close friendships even then. On the professional side, it was the period where I really became inspired by Chinese cinema. I, for the first time, having grown up in this country, never saw real Asian faces on screen. How crazy is that, right? So I thought, oh wow, this would be a great opportunity to introduce Westerners to both Chinese cinema in general, but also to Chinese people, and so they could see them in a three-dimensional light. So that really launched the beginning of my journey, I guess, to want to, really provide more opportunities for people to see Asians in a three-dimensional light. And so I brought Chinese films over. I was working closely with what at the time was the one and only China film organization, which was called 中国电影出书输入公司. They did all the distribution, all the import, all the export, all the production. Everything was under one roof. And so I worked with them to bring Chinese films out, ran a company in San Francisco with a theater. We had a loose theater chain. We saw a lot of films going to festivals at the time and a lot of great reviews. And then I was hired by the studios to open up the Chinese market for American studio films, which had been closed off since 1949. So a lot of people who lived in China at the time remember the opening of Roman Holiday or Love Story and other films that I had plucked from the very rich archives of the studios. And that somehow led to working with Steven Spielberg on the movie Empire of the Sun, which was shot partially on location in Shanghai, and we closed off pretty much the entire city. We had 5,000 extras in period costume, because back in the day you didn't paint them on computers. You actually had to have real people in real costumes on the street. So maybe that's a good start.
Yeah, and you know what, since then, as this room can attest, there's been a lot of cross-border activity between Hollywood and China. And throughout you always hear, when you go there, here are some tips, get ready to drink. Those banquets are going to last forever. And there's been a lot of cross-border activity and connections and deals done in the last couple decades, and yet people still consistently are talking past each other or misunderstanding, or deals are falling apart right when, the MOU may be signed or it's all in the press, and, nothing surprises us, but at the same time, it still manages to surprise many people. So what is the recurring, why do people still have, after 3 decades, based on, your past experience, an inability to why aren't deals getting done?
Well, there's definitely a lot more talk than there is action. There is some action. I really feel like there's extremely deep cultural differences. I mean, it sounds very cliche to talk about it, but there are some very interesting books written about one of my favorites. It's called Geography of Thought, How Asians and Westerners Think Differently, and discusses Greek philosophers, which basically gave rise to the Western civilization, and Chinese philosophers. So the Greeks came into the world knowing that a lot of people were very different from them, and they like to celebrate the uniqueness of the individual. If you look at their sculpture, their paintings, their literature, it's all about lionizing the individual and what makes that person unique. Whereas in China, they have this giant ecosystem of thinking about how we're all part and parcel of this same universe, and we are here to maintain harmony. And so we have a part in all of this, but it's really not about me, where it's about, how can I serve the group? I think that is so fundamental to so many things that I see going on even today. Chinese civilization really kind of evolved on its own axis, and there's another very good book by Gish Jin called The Girl at the Baggage Claim, which discusses an anecdote of how a Chinese woman was admitted to a very, very good school here in America, and somehow her parents ended up sending her sister instead. And how does this happen? In what universe is it okay to just sort of slip somebody else in? So there's so many differences, I think, when it comes to identity, relationships. We all know that Guanxi, relationships are important, but I think it really is a big thing. That person is more important than the piece of paper. So the two sides are coming from very, very different places. There's a lot more people are getting closer, where we see a lot of learning, a lot of really hard-earned lessons being taught, and a lot of more person-to-person contact. So many Chinese obviously coming to this country, so they're getting a feel for what the differences are. And just like many Americans and Westerners going to China. But I think fundamentally, if you grow up in China and you go to school in China, there's a very, very specific, somewhat rigid education system, and you are fed certain stories and values that are deeply ingrained. And it's very hard to just shake loose of them. America is a much younger country, and we've been very open to different cultures, and there is also some rigidity to how history is taught. But I think for China, it really goes back, like many old civilizations, goes thousands of years. So it is hard, and there's really strong value judgments about what's right or wrong or better or worse. And there's habits that are deeply ingrained, growing up with Chinese parents, even though they ended up living in America longer than they lived in China, very deeply ingrained kind of value judgment. So I think everything's changing. China, whatever you say about China, you can also say the opposite is, and make a strong argument for that. But I do think these cultural and philosophical differences are very prevalent. And it certainly arises when you're talking about story and how to tell a story. What is a good story? How to promote yourself. I think so often I want to tell, the Chinese government, this is not a good way of promoting China, because it doesn't fit the Western mindset. I feel like there's so many misunderstandings about and misperceptions of what China is, and that's based a lot on Western media's reportage, but it's also based on what the Chinese perception is of how do we look good in the eyes of others. I think they're not really understanding, the Western perspective, and vice versa. So anyway, we have a long way to go, but many of us are not daunted.
Yeah, no, that's a good point because that segues into my next question. Having said that, we hear our fair share of horror stories or of deals that haven't gone through. Rebecca writes a lot about that in the past several years. But here we are, right? And people are still doing deals, trade war, what? People are still hopping on planes and they're still talking to each other. So there obviously is a sense of optimism of some kind that keeps these two sides engaging each other. If you can speak to either personally or what you're seeing, what are the opportunities that are keeping us engaged despite the differences and despite the difficulties?
Well, I think for some people, of course, they see money. That's a very basic fact. They know the market is growing by leaps and bounds. There's a lot of investment. For others, who are more foolish, who started out decades ago, there was no money to be seen or found. So that's clearly not been my primary motivation. I have been motivated by wanting to see more of Chinese culture be exported. It sounds like it's a product, and in some ways it is, but it's really more of, again, sounding very cliched, cultural exchange, really, really examining that space where we can find interesting Chinese stories. And that's what I've tried to do in my work, really, whether it be something like Jola Club, or recently I was able to create a story that was sold to DreamWorks Animation that's now in production. In fact, I just saw the first cut, what they call a cut of the movie, which will not come out for another 2 years. But it was inspired by Chang'e, the moon goddess, or the movie I made, Shanghai Calling, which is really looking at the contemporary phenomena of Chinese Americans going to China but not speaking Chinese and creating a romantic comedy out of that, or the phenomenon of Chinese students in America. So I like real-life stories or myths and legends that are grounded in something that is already very embraceable, by what I think both sides. I think the stories in China exist, and I think it's about how you execute them for an international audience. That's my sweet spot. For many others, it's many different things. It's they want to make a blockbuster. They've attempted with, say, the Great Wall or whatever skyscraper is now doing well. So some people are looking at that space. There's many different opportunities. There's opportunities in technology, VR, AI. They're all there. So it really depends on what your interest is and whether it overlaps with China. I would only say that China is not for the faint of heart. It really does put you through the paces in terms of a lot of changes, a lot of things that are outside of your control. There you have to, I personally, I have told this to many friends of mine who are in the space, so to speak, and I said, I think one of the things I like about China is that you can't be a control freak and spend a lot of time in China. So I like the personalities that are attracted to China because we tend to be a little more adventuresome and can roll with the punches better than the ordinary person. It's simply bigger and more. There is no single person that can fully understand China, can fully predict what's going to happen, can fully say, oh, this is what is going on, because it's a massive contradictions.
That's interesting. And for those of us, because there's a lot of familiar faces in the room who've been involved, me included, in China since the 1990s. And it used to be that it was all about educating Westerners on how to understand China better when going to China, whether it was a multinational company or a film or whatever you wanted to do. The interesting part that I'm fascinated about, and I'd love to get your insight on, is over the next decade, what I see is, many of them are in the room, folks who have studied here, Chinese who are, millennials and Gen Xers who are now coming of age and staying here in the US, but traveling back and forth. Mm-hmm. So I personally get excited about this phenomenon of, the outbound Chinese interest in Hollywood. And given that your background is equally in Hollywood, what do you see in the next 10 years when you see this generation and what the possibilities are there?
I totally agree with you about that. I am very excited by the Chinese who are studying abroad and studying here. They may stay, they may go back and forth, and I mentor a lot of these Chinese students, especially Chinese women in particular, because I have a particular, liking for the women who I feel may not have the same opportunities when they're starting out in their careers in China. It is more difficult. I've had many conversations with people about the relative status of men and women in China and America. I think in China, the good news is that you're a very successful entrepreneur or business person, you get a lot of respect whether or not you're a man or woman. If you're a billionaire, it doesn't matter what gender you are. But I do think it's more difficult for women to start their careers in China, and especially as the economy is growing and there's so much wealth, there are tendencies to go back to a feudal society, the Laobans with their xiaomi, and meaning the bosses with their so-called secretaries. It's an uncomfortable culture for some people if they're used to all the talk here, which is very PC about gender equality. So I do think for young women, America provides a better breeding ground to build a career in many cases, not necessarily, but it's more of a meritocracy than it is in China when you're starting out. Again, once you're successful, I think China is a fantastic place to be because the sky's the limit. I have told many of my mentees over the years that you are the future. I think the fact that they have that Chinese education, they understand the stories, the philosophy, the thinking of Chinese, truly understand in a way that I will never understand despite all the time I've spent in China. They can bring that, and then mixed with the absorption of Western thinking and culture, I think that makes for a very, very powerful combination. The Chinese system is very specific. They can navigate through that, though I'm also being told these days that haigui, the returning sea turtles, also there's some bias against them, that almost if you've spent that 5 or 10 years outside of China, you may not be able to catch up because things are changing so quickly in China. So people do face this dilemma, like, should I stay, should I go, where should I, where do I, there's all these visa issues now too, and I think obviously people have to make their own individual choices. But there is, I don't think we've even begun to see the full ramifications of this giant growing Chinese student body that is growing up here and or there, and the influence that it has, in China.
I want to get a read of the room to see who's here that is Chinese who is interested in investing in Hollywood, or know people who are, because this is a recurring in our community here in the San Gabriel Valley. I want to invest in a Hollywood film. Do you know a producer or a blockbuster film? I would love advice. Yeah, so we've got you here. For those in the room, I don't know if they want to raise their hand.
No one's raising their hand.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
no one's raising their
What
hand.
happened to all those people that are... Yeah, there's always that abstract thinking, like how cool it would be if... But see, not a single person. What am I doing here? Gosh, I thought the whole idea was that I was going to pitch you for... No, I'm joking.
But assuming that they are listening, because I know this is a shy question, but they, I want to invest in Hollywood films. You hear that a lot. What advice would you give people?
Well, and there are certainly, it's, again, everything's changing, but we've seen in recent years a surge of the number of investors in the entertainment industry in China. Just so many, but almost to the point where it's becoming a problem because they're not terribly educated about the business. So not a few are losing their shirts, and that's going to stem the tide, probably. But even recently at the Shanghai Film Festival, the heads of the large companies said we're about to experience a bubble, and that bubble's about to burst. And so there, a lot of people rushed into the entertainment industry because the real estate market wasn't doing as well, so they're always looking for the next best thing, and it looked like it was going to be the entertainment industry. But there was, this is my interpretation of what goes on in China when things seem to kind of be hard to understand. It's just such a giant country, so trends happen so fast. There's this thing that starts out, and suddenly it's overblown and overwhelming. And I think that happened with the entertainment industry. It looked like, the periods of 2013, 14, 15, the film box office went skyrocketing. It was growing at 45%. It started with a movie called Taichung, Lost in Thailand. There's just this breakaway hit made for $5, $8, $10 million and made, over $100 million. You never see that in most markets. So quite a few films during that period, like The Mermaid and like Jianbingxia, The Pancake Man, and several films that just blew it out of the water. And so everyone thought, oh, well, that became the norm for those years. That sort of flattened out. But there's still growth, and so, a lot of people were rushing in. But they need to be a little bit more educated in terms of their discretion about how the money is spent and what projects. They tend to think that If you have a script and you have a director and you have a few cast members, then it's going to be, a hit. And that's obviously not the case there, here, or anywhere. So, so in China, there was and has been, and hopefully continues to be, a growing group of investors, but it's cooled a little bit. I do encounter people, individual investors. There are projects. I'm creating actually a platform dedicated to female Asian talent in particular, because I feel like in this whole Me Too movement craze, there's a lot of activity with women, but not so much with Asian women, and there's a lot of growth in Asian content, but not necessarily focused on that. So that's, for me, my particular area of interest. Overall, I think that the demand for content is growing exponentially. We have all these new streaming sites, and so the number of hours of content, whether it be film, television, streaming, or mobile, is just expanding everywhere in the world to such a degree. It's a little frightening, I have to say, as a producer, because back in the day when I made real movies to put in real theaters, there was a big marketing campaign, and at least everybody knew that this movie was coming out. Now, if you make a movie for Netflix, it may come and go. People may or may not know about it. It's hard to have it rise above the din of everything else, unless it's one of the very, very, very top shows. So it's a mixed bag, and we know the trend is toward mobile and also towards shorter content. So content in general the demand is growing, and whether or not the quality suffers, that remains to be seen.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. How's technology, you actually touched upon that, how has the last couple of years impacted, I guess, the industry in general, or how you work, or what you're looking at?
Well, what we see in America is what we see in China as well, is that the internet companies, the streaming platforms, are basically taking over the business. I don't know how the studios are going to really survive the Netflixes and Amazons, except that by continuing to make, movies that cost $100, $200 million and spending almost that much on marketing campaigns, those are events. They become events, and that's probably the direction it's going in. And then the Netflixes and Amazons and maybe Apple and Hulu's and whatever, they're going to be just doing a lot of really cool content. Millennials tend to not go to the movies so much anymore. So there's a big shift, and in China, for now, the box office is pretty strong, and it has been growing steadily, but it will inevitably be affected also by streaming. So how has it affected me? Well, I also am, for instance, this movie I just mentioned, the animated movie, will stream on Netflix. They say they will do a theatrical release, but I'm not going to expect it in thousands of theaters. It will be a limited release, and that will be fine, but of course I would prefer to have it in many, many theaters. Around the world it will be a theatrical. This is just the new reality. I'm very involved with the Academy of Motion Pictures, and this is a topic of discussions, like what do we do? What is the definition of a movie anymore? What is it? And recently there was something that was on television that was nominated both for an Emmy and an Academy, which we decided should never happen again, that people have to choose. Are you calling this a TV movie, or are you calling it a theatrical film? So the lines are really blurring. It's kind of a fascinating time. There's no easy answers. There's very, very staunch supporters of one kind of philosophy or another. I'm mixed. I'm very mixed. There's so much great stuff coming out in streaming. I don't want to just, neglect that whole section of the entertainment industry, but I do have a very soft spot in my heart for the major theatrical film.
What are you working on now that you can share? Because I know you're working on a number of things you can't really talk about, but what can you share with us that you're super excited about that we should be knowing?
I am pretty excited. I've never worked on an animated film before. I just was inspired by the story. I think what is so interesting about animation, you avoid a lot of the there's a reason, I think, why animation tends to be universal. Number one, you can dub it into any language. You can go actually deeper and more nuanced into the philosophy of what you want to say, because you take years and years to make it. And so you really go over every line very carefully. It's not like you have this very limited period of time to shoot. The other good thing, and I hope there's no actors in the room, but it's very hard to sometimes deal with movie stars because they are their own kings and queens of their castles, and so you really have to kind of succumb to a lot of the demands that are made, and they've often proven their worth, but things become a little bit lopsided. As a producer, you sometimes lose control over a project because of certain personalities. And I think with animation, you feel like you're in control, like you're every step of the way. So, and it's much easier to deal with certain kind of cultural issues because you can do them with sensitivity and you're not counting on any real life historical reality that might not feel right. It's all obviously fantasy. So that is something I could share. I have a couple of other projects that I would like to get made. One is the TV series in discussion. Another is actually an independent feature film based on actually Chinese students in America, parachute kids who come over at a young age, often on their own because they are not going to, their parents have decided that they're not going to make it in the very, very strict Chinese educational system and pass the Gaokao. And so they want them to come here, and so that they do a pivot. It's like, okay, you're going to go down the American system. But they often come unsupervised, and they come with, maybe a lot of money, but not a lot of support, other kinds of emotional support. So I have a lot of sympathy for them. And I'm working, I said, on this platform. I'm very involved with a number. I help organize the U.S.-China Film Summit. I'm the chair of that, which is under the auspices of Asia Society, and we're collaborating this year with UCLA. It's a China On-Screen Biennial, and we're going to bring over some major filmmakers from China and their works. And also, I brought together the Asian World Film Festival, which is the festival of Asian films submitted for Oscar and Golden Globe consideration, and another festival called the Los Angeles Chinese Film Festival. So I'm kind of at a stage now. I see a very big opportunity, actually, that literally did not exist until recently, which is to bring both the Chinese from this very growing market into in a sort of integrated space with Asian Americans and with Hollywood. And it's all kind of, I used to feel like I had 5 different lives, one in China, one in Hollywood, one in the Asian American community, one person, whatever. It's all kind of coming together because I think there's, through social media and because of realizing that we actually have a lot more in common, I'm very a big proponent of just Asians and Asian Americans in general working together. I think it's also what is being reflected now in the world on the political stage. I think America is becoming increasingly isolated for reasons we all know. And I do think that gives Asia and Asians, the whole Asian diaspora, a really unprecedented opportunity to have a voice because people are looking, there's a realignment going on for sure, both on a macro level and I believe right here in Hollywood.
That's amazing. I think we're good on time. Thank you so much. I'll follow up with you. I feel like I'm the first generation parachute kid, so I've got stories about that.
Okay, good.
But thanks,
Like to hear.
everyone.
Thank you all
Yeah,
very much
thank
for
you.
coming.